do think when I was
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Brainstorming, the Human Connection. Maybe we should even say the human condition, but it's really about our connection. And that's what we're going to be trying to do today, is to address some issues that connects us. And probably the most focused thing is the connection that the Humanities Council has brought us for the last 50 years. This is the 50th anniversary of the South Dakota Humanities Council. And today we have two one-book authors with us, Kent 1 and Kent 2. You know? And actually William Kent and Kent 2. So we kind of wait till everybody rolls in here and see how many, we don't want to leave too many people behind. But while we're getting started here and waiting for everybody to get signed on, I'd like for you all to be thinking about questions that you can ask the authors, because I'd like to keep this in very much a conversation as opposed to a few talking heads, which is, you know, it can be interesting too. But it really happens, the rubber hits the road when all of us are exchanging ideas, inquiring, those kind of things. That's when some real interesting things come up, and asking the questions that come to mind for you. And if you're too bashful or just, you know, worried about your makeup or something like that, you can put it in the chat too. You know, just put something in the chat, and then we will see that, and maybe Jennifer or Carolyn will high sign me or something and just say, hey, we got a question or something, and then we'll get back to it, because I often will get involved in the conversation and not see it, because if I keep my attention going back and forth, I'll miss more stuff than if I just stay focused on the conversation at hand. With that, let's get started. We have our guest today is Kent Meyers, and he is the author of, well, he's the author of a few books, but today we're going to be talking about his one book, The Work of Wolves. And we also have William Kent Krueger. And so we have two Kents, and we're going to call one William Kent and the other one just Kent. Okay, so we can kind of keep them straight and not be as confusing if somebody's just listening as opposed to watching as well. So with that, let's get started. Let's start with Kent Meyers. Kent, give us the elevator speech of Kent Meyers. Where did you come from? Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And how did you become an author? How did you turn into an author?
I am from Minnesota, Southwest Minnesota originally, and raised on a small farm, corn and soybeans. I moved to Spearfish, in 1980. And eventually it took me about 20 years to begin writing about Western South Dakota, because it's really remarkably different as a culture than Minnesota is, in all sorts of well, both physical and cultural ways. I started writing. I never planned to be a writer as a child. I got an English major kind of by accident. I started out in chemistry as a college student and got bored with the sciences and took a bunch of gen ed courses and fell in love with English. Got a graduate degree, a master's degree in English, still not thinking I'd write. I've never taken a creative writing course. came here, met a couple of people who went with me to the Great Plains Writers Conference in Brookings. And I regard that conference in a strange way as the beginning of my writing career. I never thought I could be a writer. I had too much respect for good writing and thought there was no way I could accomplish it. But at the Great Plains Writers Conference, it was the first time I went to a regional conference where, it wasn't, it was good writers there, but they weren't Shakespeare. They weren't, at the top of the game, and there were local and regional writers reading their work. And I just realized at that point that, I could do that. I didn't have to compete with Faulkner. I could enter at a lower level. And on the way back from that trip, the two other people with me and I formed the idea of starting a writing group, and came back here and began to meet once a week, sharing writing with each other. And I just never quit after that. So I guess that's the elevator speech, how I
All
got
right.
where I
Well,
am. Yeah.
one of the things you said sparked my curiosity, and I've asked this question at least to myself and occasionally to others too. When a person sees that there is someone who is really accomplished, can you say a little bit about what is it that it intimidates you or makes you think at that time? What can you talk a little bit about the feeling that seeing someone else do well makes you feel that you can't do it at all or shouldn't do it at all, because if that person's so good, I can't do it. If I can't do it that well, then I shouldn't do it at all. Can you talk about that feeling?
Well, I think that's just plain respect for good work. I had some really great teachers, professors at the University of Minnesota Morris, and they really showed me how complex literature was and how intellectually difficult it was. And my science friends, when I moved into English, many of them thought I was kind of taking the easy way out, and I couldn't convince them. I said, no, you guys have no idea how difficult this is, how intellectually complex it is. They just couldn't believe it, but it really is, if in a different way. And I think that's just partly, I guess, a form of respect and generosity towards people who really know what they're doing. And I think it's very healthy. I think that a lot of young writers in my own teaching experience, students kind of skip that step. They come into a creative writing class thinking that they don't really need to read, that they don't need to really understand what the tradition is and what the level that they're trying to reach is. And so I would rather have a student a little bit intimidated by it, I think, than one who's overly confident. But of course, if you stay there, then you never do realize what you're capable of. But I think there's a lot of it's a healthy response to really good work in almost any field.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll move on, but it's one of those issues that's been for me, because it's kind of like, well, if my parents were really good, it wouldn't deter me from having kids, and lots of other things we see people are good at, but we don't say, well. But sometimes in writing, I notice the people that I work with, they often have that same thing, and I'm always struggling to understand what that is. Wouldn't it make me want to say, oh, that person is really good? What's in that? How do they do that? As opposed to saying, oh, I can never do that.
Well,
but,
I still don't think I can do it. Frankly, and I'm not really being facetious here. Every time I finish a book, I really have no idea how to write another one. I mean, you only write another one by writing another one, but you don't really know how to do this. At least I don't think. Maybe William Kent will disagree with me, but there's a way in which you're always inventing it.
Yes.
And changing it. So And
Okay.
I don't want to take all the time here, but to come back a little bit, I think it's really important in my own development here. It was really important for me to understand that even great writers have bad drafts, and
Okay.
that writing does not come out of in a single kind of belch, and there it is, all finished. And so part of my development really was that realization that I can rewrite and I can take criticism and I can reform things. And again, I think that a lot of younger writers don't realize how much of that goes on. I certainly didn't when I was a student.
Interesting. Well, let's go to William Kent now. And William, can you do the same thing? Tell us a little bit about where you came from and how you developed into a writer.
Yeah, but I'm going to do something else first, Lawrence, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I want to tell everyone there how I first came to know Kent Meyers' work.
Okay.
Because he, in my book, was a great writer from the get-go. So when my first novel, Iron Lake, came out in 1998, after it came out, I got a call from a woman in Chicago. She said, "Hello, I represent the Friends of the American Writers Prize." I didn't know what that was. She said, "I just want to let you know you've won the Friends of the American Writers Prize." And then she paused a moment and said, I'm sorry, I misspoke. You came in second." The actual winner of the Friends of the American Writer Prize that year was an author named Kent Meyers, who had written a book called The Witness and Combines. And I thought to myself, oh, great, I lost to a farm book. So I had to read that farm book. And it has been few times in my life that I've read a book that just knocked my socks off, that just so amazed me with the quality of the prose that was used in the writing, with the respect for the power of language. And I fell in love with Kent Meyers' work from the get-go. And of course, after that, I had to read Light at the Crossing and let's see, The River Warren and Twisted Tree, and of course, The Work of Wolves. And although I don't aspire to write like Kent one does, I so respect his writing, and I love everything that I've read by him. So hats off to you, Kent.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
I have to say that's not quite as bad as getting an Oscar and then say, no, it wasn't you.
Yeah, I know. No, I know.
That other guy.
Fortunately, our
so
are on a much smaller scale.
Small scale.
Okay, so the elevator version of myself. Yeah, I do publish under that very literary three-name thing, William Kent Krueger. But I also go by Kent, my middle name. But for the purposes of this morning, I think we've decided I'm going to be called William Kent, so we don't get too confused. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I have for the last 40 years with my wife of, well, let's see, last March, she was my wife of 49 years. We have a big one coming up next year. Our children live here. Our grandchild is here. You know, despite the fact that we have the same legendarily bitter winters that you have there in South Dakota, I love living in the Midwest. I love the people here. Before I began to write standalone novels like Ordinary Grace or its companion novel, This Tender Land, I was best known as the author of the, boy, do I love saying this, the New York Times best-selling Cork O'Connor mystery series, which is set up in the Great North Woods of Minnesota. My protagonist in that series, Cork O'Connor, is a man of mixed heritage. He's part Irish and he's part Ojibwe. I have currently 18 novels in that series. Number 19 comes out in August, but I have had an opportunity along the way to write a couple of books, not a part of my series. The first one came out in 2013, Ordinary Grace, and that was chosen a couple of years later for the South Dakota One Book Read program. And in 2019, I published what I consider its companion novel, This Tender Land. You know, I always wanted to be a writer as far back as I can remember. I can't remember ever wanting to be anything else but a storyteller. And I part of that, I'm sure, is the result of my father. My father was a high school English teacher. And when I was a kid, he would every night put myself and my brothers and my sister to bed reading poetry to us. He read those great story poems, The Charge of the Light Brigade, Annabelle Lee, The Raggedy Man, the Highwayman. So I grew up on these great story poems with this wonderful language. And I'm sure it was his influence that made me from the get-go want to be a writer. So I've always written. But I served a very long apprenticeship. I didn't publish my first novel, Iron Lake, until I was almost 50 years old. I published it when I was 48. But I was always writing. And my problem was in the beginning, I tried to emulate Ernest Hemingway, who I'd been turned onto as a great writer by my father when I was 18 years old. And I tried for decades to write the great American novel as Ernest Hemingway might have written it, stupid on so many levels. Because what's important, I think, for every writer is not who you can copy. What's important is you discover the writer you were always meant to be, and that's a journey. And I think once you begin to feel comfortable, and that takes a long time and a lot of going up dark alleys, blind alleys, before you begin to understand, oh, this is my voice. This is what I feel comfortable writing about. This is how I can create a story that's unique. When I reached that, when I published my first novel, Iron Lake, I thought, okay, if I can get 4 novels under my belt, then I'll know how to write a book. I've got 22 novels under my belt, and every time I sit down, I think, oh my God, can I do this? Or what can I do that's going to challenge me on this one? That kind of thing. So I'm always learning as a writer. I'm always trying to make sure that I don't write the same story again and again and again.
Well, the journey that both of you spoke of in becoming a writer reminds me a lot of the issue of stage fright. And one of my earlier mentors said, if you get over stage fright, you're probably are ready to fail. Said, like there's always that point where you walk up, it gets the adrenaline going, makes you focus, humbles you, and then the part of you have to reach to become that, you're not just doing a kind of mechanical thing. Like you could probably these days anyway, AI robots can write a novel, but what they miss is that human character. And that comes, I think, from that sense of like, can I do this? Is this a thing? What am I going to do? What is this about? What do I have to be careful not to miss? That kind of exchange that a person has in their struggle with themselves. I'd like now to talk about the fact that, William, your book was Ordinary Grace, is the one that we're going to talk about today. And it was a one book as well. Can each of you talk about that experience of being a one book author? We started with Kent last time. Let's start with William Kent this time. What was the experience like being a one book author?
Yeah, let me, for those folks who are watching who might not be familiar with Ordinary Grace, let me just tell you a little bit about the novel itself. It's people think of it as an historical novel, but I don't. It was set, the story is set in the summer of 1961 in a small town deep in the very beautiful Minnesota River Valley. It's the story of a Methodist minister whose beloved child is murdered. I write mysteries, that's the compelling mystery component. But at heart, it's really the story of what this terrible tragedy does to this man's faith, his family, and ultimately the entire fabric of the small town in which he lives. When the book came out, after the book came out, and since then, I receive constantly notes from folks who have read the story and who say, this was my small town. This was where I grew up. These are the things I did when I was a kid. And I've received notes from people who grew up in cities and said, this was my neighborhood. I did these things in my neighborhood. And so what that has told me is that I was able to create a story that has many universal elements in it, many things that appeal to a broad range of people. And I think that's part of the reason it was chosen for the one book read, is the broad appeal of it. Also, I think it deals significantly with important issues that I seem to want to go back to time and again in my work. So at the heart of Ordinary Grace are the themes of forgiveness, compassion, the spiritual journey that I believe we're all on. And these, I think, are themes that, once again, appeal to a broad spectrum of readership. I was thrilled when Sherry DeBoer, who was heading up the South Dakota Book Festival work back then, called and asked me if I would be willing to do the one book read for South Dakota. But she cautioned me when she made the proposal. She said, what it means, Kent, is that you're going to have to spend a lot of time in South Dakota. Now, I got to tell you, I didn't know South Dakota before the one book read. I chose Ordinary Grace, but I know South Dakota pretty well now. And one of the things that the program did for me was it made me fall in love with South Dakota almost as much as I love Minnesota. In the small towns and the cities that I visited, in the libraries there, I found people who were passionate readers, people who enjoy talking about important, small towns as well as the cities. People enjoyed talking about rich themes and ideas, and appreciated the power of good storytelling. And on my end, I so appreciated being introduced to all of these people in South Dakota, farmers and ranchers, and the normal kind of city folk you'd find everywhere. So I, as much as maybe I contributed to the South Dakota program, I got double that in return. I guarantee it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up about people in these rural areas are actually engaged with a lot of deep subjects, because it's not the image that we have of the people who live here. Because I guess the other people who are not engaged take up a lot of the mental space, but there are a lot of very deep thinkers in this area, and I keep running into them all the time. And it's almost like when people talk about kids being bad, but they don't really talk about the kids who are doing incredible things at very young ages, 8, 9, 10 years old, already graduating from university and already making contributions, to the human condition. We don't hear about those, so we can have the idea that, oh man, it's the young generation are going to, heck in a handbasket kind of thing. So I think that, yeah, there are a lot of people out here, but they all interestingly seem like they don't want to say anything because nobody else feels like them or nobody else is thinking like them. And so the result is that they don't coalesce, and they don't get reinforcement and support for the deep thinking, and even credit for the deep thinking they do. Well, Kent,
from my perspective, that's one of the great blessings of a program like the One Book Read. It brings to the community an opportunity to gather together and do this kind of important talking, that exactly what you have been talking about, Lawrence. I'm sure Kent found that when he did the traveling as well. When did you do your one book trip, Kent?
It was 1998, I think. The book was published, I believe. I don't even know the date of my own book, but I think it was. Yeah.
Jennifer knows.
Yeah.
Okay.
2005 was the year it was chosen for the one book, so it had been out.
Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah, 2000. Yeah, I'm thinking of a different book, Jennifer. Thank you. You got a great memory. Yeah, this is 2004. Yeah, you're right.
And speaking of book, can you tell us about The Work of Wolves? What is that book about?
Oh my. The book began with a student telling me a story. She was in a Western American literature class, and we were studying a scene in the Virginian where a horse is abused. And the Virginian, who's the hero of that book, beats up the guy who's abusing the horse. And it's a long story. I won't extend it, but we were talking in that class after that scene about the ways that, you know, Western literature is filled with instances of, you know, human beings and animals, human beings and nature, and the response to those things is very much a part of Western literature. And after class, a young woman named Dorothy Dedman stopped me and asked if she could tell me a story. And she told me this story of when she lived in one of the southwestern states. I think it was Arizona. We went to high school there. And a couple of her friends in high school discovered an abused horse in a very wealthy man's pasture. And they tried to get this stopped. They went to the sheriff. The sheriff ignored them as just kind of kids who were troublemakers. And they eventually stole the horse at night and let it go. And it was returned, and the guy went on abusing it. And finally, these kids took this horse out into the desert, and it was so weak that they saw no option but to shoot it. They killed the horse to stop the abuse. They didn't see any other option. And of course, I was just stunned by this story. I was just, you know, blown away by it. And it struck me immediately as a literary story. It had, you know, if you're looking for, I think, fiction writers, I, as a fiction writer, am merely looking to the world for tension. You know, that's all the story is. It's a point of tension that gets either resolved or not resolved. And so I asked Dorothy if I could have this story, because I felt it was told to me personally. It was her story, and I couldn't just take it. But I asked her permission, and she said, yeah, you can, if you can turn this into a piece of fiction, go ahead. I thought it was a short story. It seemed like something I could get done in, you know, 25 or 30 pages. But then it just blew up. I mean, it just, a lot of things that were on my mind just poured into this novel. And so what it's about really is that story at the core, but it also involves, you know, the many Germans are really, really interested in Lakota culture. So it involves a foreign exchange student from Germany. It takes in Lakota people, which of course scared me a great deal to even think of trying to write about. But so I won't go on, but that's essentially what the story is about. Yeah.
Okay, can you tell us something about then your experience in being a one-book author?
You know, I think the most interesting thing for me, and this is kind of piggybacking on what William Kent said, is the small towns were, and I'm not putting down anybody in Sioux Falls, but the small towns were more interesting than the bigger towns in South Dakota. Not that there's any really big town in South Dakota, but it was really fascinating to me to watch. You know, you go to a small town, it's a big deal, and you get a lot of people. The groups that met me and listened to me and talked to me in the small towns were almost always larger than when I went to Rapid City or Sioux Falls or even Aberdeen. And so I don't know quite what that says. Maybe it just says there's nothing to do in a small town. And so, you know, I'll even go listen to this guy. But I think it might suggest that. I mean, but I think it suggests again, I think what William Kent was saying, there's a kind of a community, a coalescing there. I guess Lawrence, you used that term, coalescing of interest in something. And so I found that really interesting to watch that happen and be part of that.
Mhm.
You know, could I just add something here, Ken?
Sure.
Or Lawrence? All right, is it okay with you guys if I add something?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you know, one of the things I do a lot of small town rural libraries, and I prefer to do them as opposed to the large city libraries, because when you visit a large city library, you're one of many authors who have been there before.
Mhm.
You're not a unique thing. But when you go to a small community that rarely sees a real author people turn out and
Mhm.
and they treat you like a celebrity, and who doesn't want that? But one of the other things I love when I do when I did the small town events, rural events in South Dakota, was the same thing I find here. An event is often accompanied by a potluck supper, and who doesn't like a good potluck supper, right?
Yeah.
And I think those community events, the things that we can make happen, makes life happen in those places. Because as you mentioned, a lot of times there's not a lot going on. It's not just authors, and it's not just authors being new people. I mean, and special people. It's almost nobody who isn't born there and doesn't live there. They're not there. And in fact, people look at you like, why did you come here? It's
Mm.
like, it's odd for them. So somebody who is somebody coming to their town and going to speak about something that they feel they can relate to, like life in a rural town, or something with horses or animals, or something that is something that they can have some kind of emotional connection to. I think that brings something special to a town, and will give them a reason to come together that they might not have had before.
Mhm.
I'd like to go on to ask you, if both of you, if there is anything that surprised you when you were listening to people talk about your particular book, their take, for example, on your book. Any surprises there?
The single thing that sticks with me, it's just a single small event, but it's kind of funny. There is a character, a mythical creature in my book called Goat Man. And Goat Man came from artist in residency work I was doing in Mission. And these young fourth graders were telling me about this creature that runs around the reservation at Rosebud, called Goat Man, who appears out of nowhere at night and chases people, chases cars. And they kept talking about Goat Man. And finally, I said, well, what's Goat Man look like? And this little fourth grader, this fourth grade boy, goes to the chalkboard, and he takes a piece of chalk and he reaches as high as he can up that board, and he draws this astounding superhero figure with these bulging muscles and horns of a goat and body of a human standing upright. He gets all done. He stands back and he points to it and he says, there, that's Goat Man. And then he says, looks at me and he says, but you don't believe us, do you? And that really stuck with me. And so Goat Man appears in some ways, my novel is an answer to this kid, and but what I'm getting at is a Lakota elder on one of these trips I made came to me afterwards and said, when I first read your book, she said, I was going, what's he doing? Goat Man, there are no goats as part of our culture. She thought I'd made a kind of a faux pas, and she said, I was really kind of critical of what you've done. And she said, then I went and talked to my grandchildren, and they said, oh yeah, Goat Man he's out there. And so I thought that was just kind of funny and kind of cool, that there was actually a connecting between the book actually connected her to her grandchildren in ways she hadn't been connected. And I thought that was kind of appropriate and kind of cool.
Yes.
So
I think it's also a good signal that many of us, where we think we know our children, there are things that the children talk to other people about that they will never talk to us about.
Absolutely. We don't want to know our children.
Right. And it's kind of like their own private world too. It's their way that they can like separate themselves from their parents, but be still connected to their peers, and maybe even some other people like you that and they'll let you in because it's kind of like going to the library, you're a special guest. Right. And so they can experience life with you in a different way than they can with their parents, like grandparents. William Kent, what are some surprises that you had while moving around as a one book author. Some surprises about your book.
Well, one of the things that I found that was common to so many of the events that I did was either during or after the event. At the heart of my story is a family that loses a child, and what a tremendously tragic experience that is for a family. And one of the questions I asked in my novel is, how do you begin to heal from that kind of wounding? And I had so many people at the events come up and tell me a personal story about a loss that they had suffered either recently or at some point, and how much my novel meant to them in terms of moving on in their own lives, their own grieving process, and that moved me tremendously because, you know, as a storyteller, really what you're trying to do simply is to tell a good story, one that makes sense and that people might gravitate to. When you find that your story has had a deeper impact on someone, on readers, I don't know, sometimes it makes me feel like, uh-oh, I have a greater responsibility than I realized I have as a storyteller. But I found that to be quite gratifying as I went around South Dakota. That was one of the most moving things for me about the whole experience. I do have one experience that was like paramount in my whole one book, one South Dakota experience, but it happened in Deadwood. So I think, Kent, your experience was the same in that kind of your one book traveling ended with appearance at the South Dakota Book Festival. And so that was true for me. And when I went there for the South Dakota Book Festival, those of you who live in South Dakota, you know this. In Deadwood, they do the recreation of the shootouts, a couple of the famous shootouts. Well, I got to be one of the people, one of the guys who was shot during a South Dakota Deadwood replay of the shootouts. And I'll tell you, getting shot in Deadwood, South Dakota was one of the highlights of my whole life.
You got the wounds to prove it.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I want to open it up now to our audience. Do you have questions, comments on some of the things that the two Kents have been talking about? Questions, comments?
Larry?
Go ahead, Mary.
Hi, Larry. This is Mary Howe calling, and I want to say something about Kent Meyers. It's not just about what a great writer he is. When I was teaching literature of the American West at South Dakota State, and I discovered him, I used him every semester after that for the last 15 years of my career, because for so many reasons. It's great writing, the students responded. But there's a side of him that I think a lot of people may not be aware of, and that's he's perhaps the most generous human being I've ever known. He was very generous with so many struggling writers, young writers, not just at Black Hills State, but I suspect there aren't many people in South Dakota or the area who have published that didn't in one way or another get some support from Kent Meyers. And the other thing, he never failed to show up and talk to my class. And I was in Brookings, he's in Spearfish. So I mean, this is a commitment. And sometimes I felt guilty. I thought, he's so generous. I wonder if this is affecting his career, his own career, his own writing. He's taking time to drive the state and talk to my students, but I'm not as generous. I'm pretty selfish. And I thought, I want that man in my class whenever I can to talk about his writing, because it was such an experience for students to have, as William Kent Krueger said, to have an actual author talking to them, answering their questions about what they'd read. So in addition to being a great writer, he's just one of the most incredible, very decent human beings I've ever met.
Wow.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. I don't know what to say to that, but thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have something they would like to ask or comment?
Lawrence?
Yes, go ahead.
Kevin Wooster. Kevin Wooster here. First, William Kent. I I lived in South Dakota for 70 years and loved the people here in Minnesota for most of those 70 years. Lately, I got to tell you, as I see more Confederate flags flying around my state, and I see more meetings that disturb me, and I see some of the signs in Minnesota. I remember some hang Hillary, uh, unkind signs in farm country over there about President Obama, and I don't like the people here as much as I used to, and I just wondered if that has affected your feeling, either one of your feelings, the way things in my mind seem to have changed. And for example, here a state that went 62% for Donald Trump twice, and 70% of the Republicans or 80% believe the 2020 election were stolen. Does that change the way you look at these home states or home territory? Does it change the way you want to write? Do you feel an obligation? I'm sorry to pile questions on you. When things like that happen, to write about it, and things that are going on in the country today, is that likely to show up in your literature?
You know, I find the political climate, not just in Minnesota or in South Dakota, but in our entire nation, very concerning these days. And I admit there are times when I think New Zealand sounds like a great place to live right now. But I try not to be despairing. Um, my take on humanity is that at heart, most folks are good people. There is a moral compass that they're trying to follow. And although occasionally we get sidetracked or we get off on a different direction, eventually we'll come to our senses as a people and return to what I believe to be a compassionate way of treating one another. I don't know when that's going to be, Kevin. Do I feel compelled to write about it in my work? I write often about issues. In my Cork O'Connor series, I'm almost always wrapping a story around an issue that's significant to the Native community here in Minnesota, an issue that rises typically out of the interface of white and Ojibwe cultures. When I write my historical novels, I tend to, rather than deal with politics of the moment, I try to take a longer look at how things have played out, and so I don't know. You know, I have no easy answers for this. At the moment, I don't feel compelled to write about the political scene in my own work, but that doesn't mean that I won't at some point decide it's time to do that. That doesn't answer your question at all, I'm sure. But again, I don't think there's an easy answer to any of this. Kent, do you want to weigh in on this?
I'd say I'm probably more despairing than you are. And I think we're in pretty deep trouble. And I think the trouble goes back, not just to the politics, but the environment. I've been worried about the environment since I was a kid, actually. And then I kind of thought, well, you're overdoing it, and then it's like I think global warming is putting a huge amount of stress on people. Even those who deny it there's just immense stress on every single system. The environmental systems, ecological systems, economic systems, political systems. I think that we're all under way more stress than we even are able to admit. And for me, what it makes difficult is to think that other stories are important. It's really a little hard to say, well, I'm going to write a story about this such and such here when you're surrounded by. For me, I feel they're almost insurmountable, and so that I think is a truly artistic problem, a writerly problem, and then the other problem is the one you suggested, Kevin, is that there's so much division that, this notion that we began this discussion with, that literature is a way to coalesce people. It's really hard to coalesce people anymore. It's really hard to reach out to those people out there and pull them into a center that we recognize. And so I think those are, for me, those are true artistic issues. They are very difficult. I'm finding, in fact, that the fiction I'm currently working on, and I haven't published fiction for a long time, but what I'm working on right now is set in a future. It's hard for me to write about the contemporary present. I'm doing moving it into into the future, and I think that's in response to the issues you're talking about, Kevin. Yeah. Again, no real answer except that I think it's a problem for all of us, and that includes artists. I do think so. Yeah.
One of the things that comes to mind when I hear the three of you actually talk about this is the notion that the things that we're talking about is political rather than social. In other words, it's an organizational kind of thing, as opposed to a human development or human development, not just as individuals, but as a species. And I'm wondering if looking at it from that human development program perspective might lend itself not only to literature, but in terms of getting under the hood of why people finally express whatever confusion or complications they have in politics. Underneath it are some real perceptual issues. At least that's what I'm observing, is that a lot of times, you take, for example, something like racism, and you take people who will even tell you that they're racist. They own it and they're proud of it. But then if you ask them how many people of the race other than theirs that they met, usually almost none. And they certainly have no relationships with them, but they've met none. They've never actually shaken hands with somebody. And there was a poll that came out that said 75% of Americans don't know anybody outside of their particular social group, right? And we can say / racial group. They don't know anybody like that. So how can even they say they're real racist? Because they have no data, I mean, it's just completely out of thin air. So I'm just wondering, before it gets to the politics, would that be something that is writable, that actually speaks to that human part of it, the passion part, with the ability to transform into some maybe a different political perspective or different, because to me, who you are and what you do every day is more important than which political party you belong to. Would you care to respond to that?
Boy, I don't know how to respond to that. Wow. I'm just going to kind of talk all around it in hopes of at least pretending to respond. I think that the political issue is coming. It used to be, I didn't feel like I was a political person. Like I could go through my life without being political. And I think that now it's harder to not be political, to say, politics will take care of itself and all I really have to do is vote. It's harder to do that now because the political has impressed itself upon almost every other realm. So I think you're onto something really interesting there, Lawrence, that the politics is more a reaction to something else, which is kind of what I was saying about the environment. I think that there are these things underneath that are breeding the politics, but then the politics becomes the most visible and in many ways the most powerful thing. And so we're all feeling political right now, and we're all feeling political in ways that are stressing us, I think, and pushing us apart. And I don't know if I'm even answering your question, but at least I'm talking. So, I'm saying something.
But I think you're scratching a new surface. And that's what happens when we, like, at least for me, when I have to take a different step back, look at something, a different perspective, it doesn't come into focus right away, you know.
Mhm.
But I thought that all three of you hit on something that was really pertinent to like how we manage social change. And that is looking under the hood and find out where the gears turn and what is the source of that thing. And you can see sometimes when I remember, I'll try to mention this as briefly as I can. One of my mentors once, he was my mentor on radio and TV. And one day he called me to his penthouse apartment because he was like the top disc jockey in San Francisco. And I always remember he had this Chinese girlfriend, and I went into his apartment, and then later the guy who was the captain of the precinct came in, and then she came in and said the dinner's ready, and he gave her the key to his apartment, and she locked it from the outside. She said, "Now you guys can't leave until you hug each other." And he said, because Diggs, you're always talking about the pigs and the cops and this and that. And this guy's always talking about the niggers and that. He was friends with both of us. And he's saying, you guys are like, he said, but you don't understand each other. So you can't leave my apartment until y'all hug. So it was one of those moments of like, okay, we don't even know each other.
Yeah,
We've never
yeah,
had a conversation, but it was like forced on us,
right.
you know. He was one of the few people who could do that to a police captain, but it was so I'm looking for like, are there kind of ways that we can, stories we can write relative to Kevin's question? Are there stories that we can write, long or short, that can urge people or motivate people to like leave their comfort zone and take a chance, and then instruct them how to do that?
There are probably those storytellers who could do that. I'm not necessarily convinced that I'm one of them. One of the, I do write very often in my stories about social issues of the time. But what's more important to me is this, and it kind of goes to what you mentioned, Kent. You said you are much more despairing than I am.
Mhm.
One of the things that I think is incumbent on me as a storyteller is not necessarily to offer any solutions, but to offer stories that in the end encourage people not to lose hope. Because once we lose hope, where do we go from there? But if we hold on to hope, then maybe we'll look for ways to bring disparate groups together. Maybe we'll look for those solutions that are out there. But if we're not hopeful, what do? Maybe we just barricade ourselves and pretend that it doesn't exist. But here's another thing that for me, and it's personal and it's really selfish, I find I take great solace and rejuvenation when what I do is I turn to my work. When I bend to my work every morning, I'm doing something that refreshes me and that allows me to go out and deal with the world in whatever way I have to deal with it. So I take great comfort in the work, and when I do that, I think what that does is it helps me do whatever I can in my stories to offer comfort to others.
Thank you for that.
I don't know what that means, but there it is.
No. Okay, I mean, there's all kinds of nuggets in that. There's all kinds of interesting things that point to other things to think about. Are there any other questions, comments from our other co-conspirators here?
If there aren't any questions, could I ask Kent a question?
Sure.
So
Sure.
Kent, when might we see this futuristic novel?
Oh, I don't know. I shouldn't have even mentioned it.
Have you been at work on it for a while now?
Yeah, it's
In the future.
Yes, in the future, yes. By the time you see it, it'll be contemporary.
In its appropriate place,
I
Well,
don't know.
I have,
I don't know.
I have, I have another question on your books, and we're getting near the end of our hour here. That's really gone by pretty quickly. Did you find any common misconceptions about what you're writing about and how you were thinking about it? And then some people reading it, but having a different take. Because I learned from people who write fiction that they write fiction in such a way that people can take it and make their own stories. And as a nonfiction writer, I have to say there's not enough rope there to tie a knot for me. I never can get that idea. It's like, well, if you want a story, go write your own story. You know, why are you going to get mine? But that's a whole different way of looking at it. Have you found that people have a different idea than you have of a character and a different take on stuff? And how do you process that?
Do you want to take that one first, William, Kent, or you want me to talk?
I can take that one because it pertains to Ordinary Grace in a big way. Ordinary Grace is about a minister, Methodist minister, and his family, and for me, it was a story about the importance of the spiritual journey that I believe we're all on, whether you embrace that or not. I have had a lot of readers read it and comment either favorably that this is a wonderfully religious novel, or unfavorably that this is a religious novel that I don't want to have anything to do with. And my response is, it's not about religion. I'm Methodist, but I don't think of myself as a religious person. In fact, I have a great mistrust of anything once it becomes any idea once it becomes bounded by a set of rules or requirements or expectations. I think it loses a great deal. But I did want to talk about the spiritual journey. So when people say this is a religious book, I said, no, it's a spiritual book. That was what I was shooting for, is a spiritual book. I wanted to talk about the spiritual journey. I wanted to talk about the difficulty that as human beings we have in finding a place of compassion. How do we make that difficult journey to the place of forgiveness when we've been greatly wronged or greatly wounded? But it's not about religion. So yeah, I get that.
Kent?
Well, my I guess answer to that is more abstract. I think that if you're writing well, you simply have to accept that readers will not get certain things. In fact, I think that's one of the, I'm always kind of pleased when I write a book and readers simply don't notice what I've done with it. I think that hidden substrate, that unconscious or invisible architecture, is part of what powers literature. And if readers don't see it, and if you're willing, shall I say, to put something in, knowing that it's highly unlikely readers are going to get this, I think that's actually what a writer wants. Because if you're not willing to do that, you're going to explain. And when you explain, you're going to ruin the literature. And so I think that most of the writers I know, right on that line where they're doing things that they know they're doing, and that it would please them if someone came along and said, "Oh, I saw what you did here."
Yeah.
But mainly, we just are willing to not have that happen. And so, I mean, this is just a general response to that. And I think there's a lot of things that I put into books that readers have never commented. I thought they were really smart, Readers have never commented on them and never praised me for them, but I'm actually pleased they haven't. I think that's a good thing.
And here's the truth that every storyteller comes to understand is, once you've written the story and you've put it out there, it's no longer your story.
It's no longer your story. Yes,
Readers
it's somebody
bring to it
else's.
their own
Yeah.
expectations, their own perceptions, their own prejudices, or whatever, and they read your story in whatever way they're going to read your story, and that has very little to do with how or why you wrote the story.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Well, we have come up on the end of our program, and I have really enjoyed this conversation. And I'd like to have you guys back sometime to talk about some of your other books, and also about writing and the human condition, and our human connection. What are we doing? What are some ways that we can connect with each other? So with that, thank you everyone for showing up and being a part of this conversation. And we'll see you next time, same station.
Okay,
You
good
all.
to see y'all.
Bye.